let's look at some classifications of lines by slope. And I apologize for this being tilted here, but it just copied bad. Now this says classifications of lines by slope. Okay? Now this doesn't mean that this tells us what the slope is. It just is a way to describe it. Now when we read graphs, just like we read a book, we read from left to right. So if I look at this line here and I read the graph from left to right, I can see it's going up. If a line goes up from left to right, we say it has a positive slope. That doesn't tell us what the slope is. The slope is a number like 4/3, or a slope is a number like 5 or 2 or something like that. But this just describes the slope. If it rises from left to right, we know that my slope is positive. Along those same lines, if a graph falls from left to right, again, that's how we read graphs, if it's going down, we say it has a negative slope. Okay. Now what about a line that doesn't change at all? Remember, what slope tells us is what's happening to a line as we move from left to right. Well, if I walk across this line from left to right, I'm not changing at all. Okay? I'm staying constant. And that's why this line says it has a 0 slope. Slope tells us how much something is changing. Well, from left to right, how much does this change? It doesn't. 0. And that's why a horizontal line has a 0 slope, because it doesn't go up or down at all. Now, if you look here at this vertical line, think again what slope means. It tells us how much we're changing as we move from left to right. Well, if I try to move from left to right on this line, I pretty much fall off the line because it doesn't go left to right at all. That's why we say it's undefined. So whenever you have a vertical line, it's okay, it's a line, but its slope is undefined. We can't say what's happening as it moves from left to right because it isn't moving from left to right. And if you think back to previous examples, when we were actually using the slope formula to figure this out, that's when the denominator would be 0, or you'd be dividing by 0. Okay, and that's why we say that this is undefined. Okay? Again, these classify. These describe the slopes of lines. They do not tell us what the slope is. And be careful in your homework that if it asks you to find the slope, you give a number. If it asks you to describe the slope, well then you can say, well, it's positive or negative. And of course, 0, either way you look at it, you get 0 or undefined. But again, these describe the types of lines. Let's look at an example. It says find the value of y so the line passing through the points 3y and 1, 5 have a slope of -2. Now whenever I see a slope of -2 or whatever, that negative, I get a picture in my head saying that when I look at this graph from left to right, it's going to be going down. Okay? So it's just a good check to give us a visual of what the slope looks like. Now, if I'm going to find out what this missing value is, I want to use my slope formula. The difference in my y's minus the difference in my x's. Okay, again, this is our slope formula, something you're really just going to memorize. And I'm going to label these points. I'm going to call this x1, y1, and I'll call this x2, y2. Okay. Now, let's fill in our missing parts here. y2 is 5. Minus our y1, which is y, over our x2, which is 1, minus our x1, which is 3. And now what that tells us is that this has to equal -2. This has to be equal to -2 because it's our slope. Remember, this is what our slope equals. Okay. So let's focus right here on just this. Let's simplify and solve this equation. 5 minus y over 1 minus 3, which is a -2, has to equal -2. What are we solving for? Well, let's solve for y. So what do we have to get rid of first? In this case, it's usually easiest to get rid of the -2 instead of trying to distribute it out. Okay? So how do we get rid of this -2? Well, we're dividing, so let's multiply. Okay? Again, solving equation, guys, we're going to always come back to solving equations. Notice these -2's cancel out and I'm left with 5, and instead of saying minus y, I'm going to go plus a -1y, just to help me remember that it's negative. And over here I'm going to go -2 times -2, which is 4. Solving the equation, I'm solving for -1y, so let's get rid of the 5. I do that by subtracting 5 from each side. These cancel, I'm left with -1y equals -1. Now if I divide both sides by -1, I get y equals a +1. So the value of y that we can put in here to make it have a slope of -2, we get 1. Okay? So for this problem, just use the slope formula, okay? Use your knowledge of solving equations, and you'll be able to find the missing value.